The city of Rockford paid a demolition crew to haul away a condemned building on Kishwaukee Street. That crew charged somewhere around $12,000. The job. The cost to dump 40 fiber cement boards at the edge of an encampment under the Route 173 overpass was nothing. No invoice, no line item. They backed the truck to the chain link gap, slid the boards off the flatbed, and drove away. In under 4 minutes, Trace Alderman was sitting 40 feet away when they did it. He watched the whole thing from where he was eating, a cold can of pork and beans he'd opened with a church key he kept on a piece of baling wire. He didn't walk over right away. He sat there for a few more minutes eating, looking at the stack. The boards were gray-white, a little dusty from the demo, some of them, cracked along one corner, most of them intact. 40 boards, give or take. The crew hadn't counted them either. He was 22 years old. He'd been living under that overpass for 14 months by then, in a tent that had been repaired so many times the original material was maybe 40% of what was still holding it together. The rest was hardware store plastic sheeting, duct tape, and a section of rain poncho he'd sewn in with dental floss along the left seam. The tent didn't fail dramatically. It just failed constantly, a little at a time. A new leak here, a new fold where. The frame had bent, a corner that no longer stayed staked because the ground under the overpass was compacted gravel, and most tent stakes won't hold in that. He'd been thinking about the tent problem for months, not because it bothered him emotionally, because it was a practical problem that kept getting worse, and the solutions he had access to kept running out. When the demolition crew left, Trace set down his can, walked over to the stack, and picked up the board on top. Fiber cement board. He knew what it was, not from construction experience, from looking at it. The weight told him something. The surface told him something else. It was not wood. It was not dissolve in rain. He set it back down and went and got his flathead screwdriver. Trace Alderman grew up in Rockford, which is about 90 miles west of Chicago, along the Rock River. He aged out of the foster system when he turned 18, and had 4 years of short-term housing situations after that. A cousin's, couch, a room in a transitional program on Auburn Street, a period sleeping in, his car before the car stopped running, and then the encampment. He didn't drift there from somewhere else. He'd lived in Rockford his whole life. The overpass he camped under was 3 miles from the elementary school he'd attended. The encampment under Route 173 had roughly 30 people when Trace arrived. By the time the cement boards showed up, it was closer to 19. People move around. Some get housed, some leave for other cities, some just aren't there. One morning and nobody knows why. The people who stay tend to stay a long time, because leaving requires somewhere to go, and the people who've been there the longest have usually already tried the somewhere else options. Trace's spot in the encampment was on the east end near the concrete footing of the overpass support column. He'd chosen it because the column blocked wind from the north, and in Rockford, wind from the north between October and March is not a minor thing. It drops the felt temperature by 10 to 15 degrees depending on the day. His first winter under the overpass, that column mattered more than almost anything else he had. He had a tarp rigged to the column and staked to the ground, making a lean-to that backed against the concrete. The tent came later, when someone left one behind after they moved out. He set the tent up inside the tarp structure, which gave him 2 layers, an outer one that blocked most of the rain and a second one that held a little heat. It worked. Until it didn't. The tent's zipper failed in. Month 3, the tarp developed a tear in month 7 that he repaired with Gorilla Tape, and that repair held through one winter and started failing again the following spring. What Trace had when the boards arrived was a structure that was solving the problem poorly and getting worse at it. What the boards were, he didn't know yet. He knew what they were made of. He didn't know what he was going to do with them. He spent the first afternoon just moving the boards. He counted them as he moved. Them? 41 it turned out, not 40. The demolition crew had not been precise. Each board was roughly 5 feet long and about a foot wide, and weighed somewhere between 6 and 8 pounds depending on whether it had absorbed any moisture. Most of them were in reasonable condition. 8 had a cracked corner. 3 had a longer crack running most of the way across, which made them weaker. But not useless. 2 were split almost completely through. He put those 2 aside. He stacked the good ones in a different order than they'd been dumped, laying them flat, alternating direction so the stack wouldn't tip the way he'd seen. Lumber stacked at a hardware store he used to walk past on West State Street. He'd never worked in construction. He'd never taken a trade class. But he'd walked past that lumber yard probably 300 times, and he'd looked at it the way you look at things when you have time and not much else to do. The cracked boards he kept separate. He ran his thumb along the crack in each, one, feeling how far it went, whether the board still held together under pressure. Most of them did. A crack in a cement board doesn't mean the board falls apart. It means there's a weak point, and you have to plan around it. He stacked those in their own pile with a piece of cardboard on top so they'd be easy to find. Then he stood back and looked at everything. He didn't have a plan yet. He had materials and a problem and time. The problem was specific. His current structure leaked on the northwest corner, when the rain came in at an angle, which it often did. The tent poles were bent, enough that the rain fly no longer sat at a slope. It had sagged in the middle, which meant it collected water instead of shedding it, and that pooled water eventually soaked through. The floor of the tent held moisture. On cold nights, that moisture became a much more serious issue than just being wet. He also had a secondary problem, which was wind. The column blocked wind from the north, but not from the west, and a hard west wind in an Illinois winter gets under a tent fly and creates pressure differentials that pull at stakes and bend poles and eventually just fail the whole thing. Cement board was not going to bend. It was not going to absorb water. It was not a framing material. It had no structural depth, no load-bearing logic on its own. A single cement board leaned against something would hold. A cement board spanning a gap with nothing under it would crack. He knew this from holding them. He understood weight distribution from carrying, things from loading and unloading, from being a person who moved his own belongings by hand for 4 years and learned how materials behave under stress. There was no textbook in that. There was just 41 boards and a problem, and a person who'd been looking at problems for a long time. He started with a perimeter. The ground under the overpass was compacted gravel, which meant he couldn't dig. He needed the boards to stand upright without being buried. The way he solved this was with weight. He gathered broken concrete chunks, there were plenty of them along the perimeter of the overpass, remnants of old pours and patches, and he used them as base supports, setting each board vertically against a pile of chunks that held it in place from the outside. 2 chunks per board, pushed tight against the base on the side the board would lean against. He set the first board on the north side against the concrete column. He set the second, one touching the first, overlapping the edge by about 2 inches. He worked east, then south, then back west, making a 3-sided enclosure against the column. He left the 4th side open, the south-facing side, for entry, not because he planned it that way from the start, but because when he ran out of good boards on the 3rd side and stood back to look, he realized that leaving that side open was actually correct. South-facing open meant the prevailing wind came from the back and sides, not through the entrance. Rockford wind patterns had taught him that. The walls were about 4 feet high when he ran out of boards for the sides. He had 14 boards left, counting the cracked ones. He slept inside the perimeter that first night, on his sleeping bag, with no roof. It was late September. The temperature dropped to 48 degrees. He was not warm, but he was not exposed to wind in the way he'd been before. And that was already different. The roof problem was the harder one. A cement board lying flat will hold its own weight. It will not span a long gap. Without cracking, it needs support underneath at intervals. He'd learned this by testing. He took one of the boards and laid it across two concrete chunks about 2 feet apart. Solid, he moved the chunks further apart. 3 feet, still, solid. 4 feet. He pressed down on the center with both hands. It flexed, slightly, not enough to crack, but he felt it. He moved the chunks to 3.5 feet and pressed again. Almost no flex. 3.5 feet became his span limit. The walls of his enclosure ran about 7 feet on 2 sides and 5 feet on the third. He needed to cross those spans with boards and have the boards supported. Every 3.5 feet. That meant he needed internal supports, things the roof boards could rest on that weren't the outer walls. He found them in the encampment junk pile. Every encampment accumulates a junk pile. Things people leave, things that get scavenged and then abandoned, broken. Furniture, pieces of shelving. In the Route 173 pile, there were 2 metal shelving brackets from a commercial rack, bent but not broken. There was a section of square steel tube about 4 feet long, probably from a bed frame. There were 3 wooden pallets in varying states of decay. He took the 2 metal brackets and the steel tube. The pallets he left. They would absorb moisture and rot, and he was done building with things that rotted. He positioned the steel tube vertically as a center post, wedging it against the concrete column base and bracing it with stacked chunks on 3 sides. It didn't go into the ground. It stood because it was wedged, and it held because it was. Steel and the forces on it were compression, not shear. He ran the 2 bent shelving brackets from the top of that center post diagonally toward the outer walls, resting the ends on top of the wallboards. Those brackets became the ridge structure, not a true ridge beam, but a line of support that the roof boards could lean against from both sides. He laid the roof boards at an angle, resting the high end on the bracket and the low end on the outer wall. He staggered them slightly so the edges overlapped by an inch. Overlapping edges meant water hitting the seam would run down rather than through. The first rain came 4 days after he started building. He sat inside and watched the water run off the edges of the roof boards and drip onto the gravel. Outside the walls, not a single drop came through the roof. The entry side needed a solution. An open south wall stopped the wind, but not. Rain driving in from a low angle on rainy days, and Rockford gets rain that comes in low when the pressure systems move through. He needed something that broke the angle without blocking the opening entirely. He needed to get in and out. He solved it with one of the boards he'd set aside as cracked. He didn't hang it or hinge it. He leaned it across the opening at an angle, resting the bottom on the ground inside and the top against the edge of the roof overhang. It wasn't a door. It didn't open and close. It was a baffle, a board at an angle that deflected wind-driven rain upward before it could enter the space. To get in, he moved it. To sleep, he put it back. It took 4 seconds to move and 4 seconds to replace. He made a second baffle from another cracked board and leaned it on the outside, angling outward. 2 baffles at opposing angles created a small vestibule effect. Wind hitting the outside baffle turned upward. Rain hitting the inside baffle turned back. Not perfect, but measurably better than nothing, and nothing was what he'd had before. He spent one evening running his fingers along every seam between boards, inside and out, looking for gaps. He found 6 places where boards hadn't overlapped, quite enough, and light came through. He filled 3 of them with strips torn from the remains of his old tent. The fabric was still dense enough to stuff a gap. The other 3 he packed with a mix of dried leaves and gravel pressed into the crack. Not ideal, but those gaps never leaked in the rain. The packing held. The floor was last. He had 4 boards remaining when the walls and roof were done. The floor under, the overpass was gravel and packed earth, which meant moisture wicked up through the night. His sleeping bag had been losing insulation for months, partly because of ground moisture. Sleeping on wet ground, even in a good bag, drops your effective temperature rating by a wide margin. He laid the 4 remaining boards flat on the ground inside the structure, end in 2 rows. They covered most of the interior floor, not all of it, but the area where he slept and where he kept his gear. He slept on those boards. That night, for the first time, with a folded moving blanket between him and the cement. The temperature that night was 41 degrees. He was warmer than he'd been in months. Not because of the boards alone. The walls were breaking the wind. The roof was keeping in whatever heat his body put out, and the raised floor surface was cutting off ground conduction. All 3 things together. Any one of them alone would have helped. Together, they did. Something different. He lay there in the dark and listened to the freeway above him and the distant sound of a train moving along the old rail yard corridor, and he thought about the fact that a demolition crew had backed a truck up to a chain-link gap and slid a stack of materials off a flatbed and driven away, and now he was lying in a structure with solid walls and a waterproof roof that had taken him 9 days to build. He didn't think of it as luck. He thought of it as a problem that had finally had materials match it. Other people in the encampment watched the building happen. Trace wasn't the kind of person who explained what he was doing while he was doing it. He worked. In the morning, when the light was good and the temperature was bearable, and when he stopped. Nobody asked many questions. A few people watched from a distance. A woman named Deb, who'd been at the encampment longer than almost anyone, walked over on day 5 and looked at the partial structure for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "What are you using for the roof?" He told her. She looked at the bracket and the center post and the angle of the boards and nodded. She didn't say it was good. She said, "The rain's coming Tuesday." He knew. He worked faster on day 6. The rain came on a Tuesday, as Deb said it would. Trace was inside when it started. He sat against the concrete column and listened to rain hitting the angled boards above him, the sound moving across the roof as the wind shifted. The water ran off. The inside stayed dry. He sat there for 2 hours while the rain moved through. The structure that Trace built from those 41 fiber cement boards is not a house. It will not survive a sustained 70-mile-per-hour wind event. It is not insulated. It doesn't have a heating source beyond the body heat it retains. In a hard enough freeze, sustained below 0 for multiple days, it would not be sufficient on its own. He knows this. He doesn't describe it as something it isn't. What it does do is stop the wind. It sheds rain from every direction he's tested. The floor keeps him off the ground. The walls retain enough heat that the interior temperature runs roughly 8 to 12 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. Outside on cold nights, not because of any magic in the material, but because walls stop convection and a roof traps what rises and a floor breaks conduction. Those are physics, not opinions. They work whether you understand them or not. He built the structure in 9 days, working alone, with no power tools, no purchased materials, no instruction. The tools he used were his flathead, screwdriver, a rock he used as a hammer, and a piece of rebar he found in the junk pile that he used to lever boards into position. That is the complete list. The thing about fiber cement board that most people don't think about is that it was designed to be weatherproof. That's its whole job. It gets attached to the outside of houses specifically because it does not rot, does not absorb water, and does not degrade rapidly from freeze-thaw cycles. A board that came off a demolished building on Kishwaukee Street had already been through Illinois winters. The ones that weren't cracked were going to hold. Trace didn't know the technical history of the material when he started. He knew what it did from touching it and testing it from the first afternoon when he picked up a board and felt that it was heavy and dense and not like anything that absorbed or weakened in his hands. That information was enough to start working. The rest he figured out by testing before committing: the span limits, the overlap distance, the baffle angle. Each of those came from trying something small, watching what happened, and adjusting. Nobody taught him this sequence. It's not a sequence anyone teaches exactly. It's just the sequence you arrive at when you have materials and a problem, and you can't afford to be wrong. The structure is still standing, not because nothing has happened to it since. Things have happened. A very windy night in October lifted one of the roof boards at the edge and cracked the corner further. He repositioned it and added a second concrete chunk to hold the base of that wallboard tighter. The crack got no worse. A week of hard rain in November moved water under the floorboards on the south end, and he re-leveled them by adding flat stones under the low corner. That took 20 minutes. He repairs things the same way he built them, by looking at what changed, figuring out why, and doing the smallest thing that fixes it. He doesn't over-engineer the repair. He doesn't tear out what's working to fix what isn't. He patches the specific thing that failed and leaves everything else alone. The two baffles at the entry have been repositioned several times. The optimal angle for the inside baffle is different in winter than in the other seasons, because the prevailing wind angle shifts when the cold fronts come through. He moves them maybe twice a year. It takes a few minutes each time to find the angle, where the wind in the vestibule goes still. What Trace knows about building things, he knows from having built this thing. Before the 41 boards arrived, his experience with construction was theoretical and second-hand, things you absorb by watching, by proximity, by being a person who pays attention to how the physical world is organized, because you live in it in a more direct way than most people do. What that kind of knowledge misses is scale and sequence. Knowing that cement board sheds water doesn't tell you how to position it, so the shed water doesn't collect somewhere worse. Knowing that a span will flex doesn't tell you exactly how far before it cracks. You learn those things by doing them at a small scale. He tested the span on a gap that didn't matter before he committed to a gap that did. He tested the baffle angle with the board propped loosely before he settled it into final position. He ran his hands along every seam before he called any section done. That sequence, test small, find the failure point, commit only after you know what the failure point is not something he articulated while he was doing it. It's just what the work looked like from the outside. There is a thing that happens when you build something that actually works. It's not the same as finishing something. Finishing is just the point where you stop. Adding to it, working is different. It's when the thing does what you made it to do in the conditions that were the whole reason you made it. The first time Trace sat inside that structure in rain and stayed dry, he was not celebrating, he was checking. He ran his hand along the interior walls to see if any moisture was coming through the seams. He looked at the ceiling boards for wet spots. He checked the floor where the entry baffles met the ground to see if water was running in from that angle. When none of those things happened, he sat back and stayed there until the rain stopped. Working means something different when you built the thing yourself out of what was available, and the thing that was available was material someone else threw away. The demolition crew charged $12,000 to clear that building on Kishwaukee Street. They made their money. They moved to the next job, the boards. They dumped cost them nothing to get rid of, and cost Trace nothing to collect. The cost of what he built from them is 9 days of labor, a steel tube from a junk pile, 2 shelving brackets, and a rock he used as a hammer. That structure has been through one Illinois winter. It is still standing. Deb asked him, maybe a month after he finished, whether he'd show her how he did the roof. She wasn't asking because she wanted to build one like it. She had her own setup, a larger tarp situation with a wooden frame that had been there longer than Trace had. She was asking because she wanted to understand the logic. He showed her. He walked her through the center post and why it was wedged not planted. He showed her the span test, 2 concrete chunks on the ground, a board, across them, hands pressing down to show where the flex started. He showed her the overlap angle and why 2 inches was the number he'd landed on. He walked her around the outside and pointed to where the water ran when it rained, tracing the path with his finger from roof to ground. She watched all of it. At the end, she said, "You worked it out yourself." He said, "Took me 20 years to stop being surprised when that's possible." He didn't say anything back to that. They stood there for a minute, looking at the structure, and then she walked back to her side of the encampment. The one thing this story does not do is solve what came before it. Trace Alderman is 22 years old and has been living under a Route 173 overpass in Rockford, Illinois for 14 months because housing in America is not organized around making sure 22-year-olds who age out of foster care don't end up in encampments. The fiber cement shelter he built is better than the tent it replaced. It is not a solution to that problem. It never was. He knows that. He doesn't describe it as a solution. He describes it as a thing that keeps him drier and warmer than what he had before, which is exactly what it is. If you live near any kind of construction or demolition site, any kind anywhere, one specific thing is worth knowing. Demolition crews, renovation crews, and framing crews regularly discard materials that are either overstocked or slightly damaged but not structurally failed. Fiber cement board, OSB panels, metal, flashing, foam insulation sheeting, concrete blocks. These materials don't go to waste in the sense of being destroyed. They go to a dumpster or to the side of a road or dumped at the edge of a property that the crew doesn't own. In most American cities, those materials are legal to take if they're on public right-of-way or if the property owner confirms they're discarding them. Call the crew foreman. Walk up and ask. The worst answer is no. The second worst answer is that they're going in the dumpster anyway, and sometimes that opens a different conversation. This is not a call to solve homelessness by scavenging. It's a small and specific piece of information about where usable materials sometimes are. The information isn't suppressed. It's just not in the places where the people who need it tend to look because nobody aimed it there. Take one look today at whatever's being built or torn down within 2 miles of where you are. That's the action. Just look. Trace Alderman taught himself how to do this by doing it. The 41 cement. Boards were real. The 9 days were real. The structure with no power tools, no purchased materials, no instruction. That's where this came from. That is the source. It is still standing.